The financial crisis of 2008 in the United States with all the global implications. So what you said is roughly this particular crisis of 2008 to capitalism is almost like 1991 to the Soviet Union. Do you make this analogy or comparison in a very broad philosophical sense, or it's very concrete that can be, list 1, 2, 3, 4, there are similarities there? So I'd like to hear your views on that powerful statement. Yeah.
Both.
Yeah.
Because if your philosophical statement is not backed by concrete analysis, then it's not worth anything. And if the concrete analysis makes sense, then there has to be a philosophical overarching argument. Look, capitalism would have died a long time ago, in 1929, if it wasn't for the Second World War. The Second World War essentially saved capitalism by saving American capital. In combination with Roosevelt's New Deal, essentially what happened was central planning saved capitalism. The war allowed the politics to coalesce around a central plan. And then after the war, capitalism was given another lease of life by extending the American central plan in the way that I described during my lecture in Europe and in Japan. And that essentially extended the life of capitalism all the way to the 1970s. That system died when America lost its surpluses. And then capitalism was given another major boost by completely reversing the surplus recycling mechanism that the Americans had created between 1944 and 1971. Remember that between 1944 and 1971, the Americans had a surplus. The money that they were making from the surplus they were giving to Europe and Japan. That was what's happening up until 1971. After that, the Americans had a deficit, which they used to suck into the United States the surplus of Germany, of France, of Japan, and then China. This is what kept capitalism alive. Chinese savings, Japanese savings, profits were created in this country, and in Japan, and in Germany. But it was a kind of symbiosis, because your factories could work fast and well because you had demand from the Americans who didn't have the money. So they printed the money and they gave it to the German capitalists, to the Japanese capitalists, to the Italian capitalists, to the Chinese capitalists, who then did what with the money? They took it to Wall Street. So the recycling gave capitalism its most exorbitant, dynamic phase, what we call globalization. Right? It was all globalization, because Bretton Woods was global too. But this is globalization with financialization and anarchy, complete anarchy, because it is the bankers who are doing the recycling, and the governments do not have the control that they used to, at least the American government, or the German government. You remember, in the International Monetary Fund, that was serious discussions they were having up until 1974. They would get together in Washington and decide amongst themselves exchange rates. They were not leaving it to the markets. So after that, it was not anarchic, but an interesting recycling mechanism, which was based on a really non-neoliberal, anti-neoliberal, and anti-capitalist notion. The idea that the whole thing is run on the basis of the American deficit. Without the American deficit, global capitalism would die. This is what I say in this book, which you very kindly brought here. The Global Minotaur. This is what I say about the Minotaur is the American deficit, which needs to be fed by everybody else to keep the world capitalist economy in a kind of unbalanced equilibrium. 2008 was the new 1929. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that simply accelerated this recycling mechanism, which I call the Minotaur. So 1991 was the end of Soviet communism and Eastern European communism. 2008, the new 1929, this time, I believe, killed capitalism. Because the American political system, which gave capitalism an extended life during the war, in 1945, in the 1970s, after 2008, I don't believe they can do it anymore. I do not believe that capitalism can be given another new lease of life by the American political establishment. You can see, they're dysfunctional. They cannot build nuclear submarines. Take a train from New York to Washington. It doesn't work. It breaks down. You have to go and get out and walk. America has lost its capacity. The American state has been hollowed out. Yeah. They cannot build bridges. They used to be able to, really very well. Okay? So the American state can no longer manage world capitalism. And in addition to that, going more into the roots of the capital accumulation process, and this is the topic of my last book, which you kindly mentioned, Techno-Feudalism, totally spontaneously, completely unplanned, a new form of capital has been born, what lives in here, with the Googles, the Metas, the Apples, and so on. So you have it too. The only two countries that have it, the United States and China, with Bilibili, with WhatsApp, with Baidu, and so on. But in the West, this capital is completely without control, without political supervision, and it has a fantastic capacity to create new fiefdoms, a new form of feudalism, which is digital feudalism. I call it techno-feudalism. And even though capital has triumphed, capitalism, and that is the main hypothesis of my book, has already been transformed without us even realizing it into a form of techno-feudalism. So in that sense, I'm saying that 2008 was to capitalism that which 1991 was to Soviet communism, its end.
I got your message, yeah. I think it's a very philosophical as well as also a down-to-earth approach to this analysis. Now, I'm thinking of this very issue you mentioned, actually this kind of recycling of the US money, by Germany, Japan, later China. It had to do with the way the Chinese embraced globalization. And here I can add a footnote, because at that time I was working in the Chinese government, having the chance to meet with many Chinese leaders. Actually, within Chinese leadership, there also debate about this, how to face with this globalization. Basically, at that time, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping has a thinking more or less like this, we cannot continue the Soviet model, this within the Soviet socialist camp, you traded with each other. Mm-hmm. That will not be internationally competitive. Mm. So basically, we have to have relations with the capitalism, with this globalization pushed forward by the United States. But here at that time said the famous phrase in Chinese called the 趋利避害, which literally means maximize its advantage and minimize or ward off its disadvantage. Yeah. Yeah. So more specifically, at that time, the United States pushed this, what we call the comprehensive globalization. It's both economic, political, financial, privatization, democratization, whatever, liberalization, etc. So Deng Xiaoping argued that for economical liberalization, yes. Political liberalization, no. But Gorbachev embraced both, and he failed. Even for the economic globalization, we should also adopt same approach, a critical approach. In the areas where China has more confidence, say we have relatively low labor costs, we have relative other conditions, so we are more open. But in other domains, for instance, capital market, we have been very cautious on that because we're not sure that will work.
It will never work.
Yeah, you're right. So with that approach, China has managed to be one of the very few countries on the whole, you may say, the winner or partial winner of this globalization. So even up to today, most Chinese, both the grassroots and top-level leadership, still think globalization is on the whole a positive thing. We are beneficiary from the process. As a result, China has become better and richer and prosperous than before. Yet there is the downside, a cost to this as well. So look at China today. When you talk about the 2008 crisis, some people say in 1989, China saved socialism. In the year 2008, China saved capitalism.
It's correct.
Yeah.
It is correct.
So now again, the West is in crisis, the United States is in crisis. We have already written, many of us written this on this argument. We cannot save the United States again. We will not do that. Same with the central government, because U.S. senior officials came to China, urged China to buy their treasuries. We actually sell more and more, obviously.
I'm saying this because we have students here. Yeah. Don't think in terms of black and white about globalization. This is good or good thing or a bad thing. Before you go anywhere near globalization, you've got to firstly to define what it is. Do we mean intensified international trade? That's always a good thing. Yeah, it's always a good thing to trade more. But that's not what globalization is. Globalization, the way I understand it, which comes out of the 1970s, is the total unhinging of financial power, allowing money to rule the world. That's what globalization was. Essentially, power shifted. In a way, if you want to think of the transformation of feudalism to capitalism, power shifts from landowners to the owners of factories. To put it bluntly, the owners of capital, from the owners of land to the owners of capital. Right? That's the great transformation from feudalism to capitalism. Then, with financialization, you have another transition from the owners of capital to the bankers. The bankers were supposed to be the servants of capital. But with globalization, they became the masters of the universe. With one press of the button, they could destroy two countries at once by taking billions and billions from one country, from, let's say, the United States, hollowing out whole manufacturing areas, destroying the working class there, and throwing the money into Korea, right? And then, when the bubble bursts in Korea, they press the same button and the money leaves Korea, and Korea is destroyed in 1998. That exorbitant power of the money men, that's a terrible thing. But we must not conflate that with trading.
At this point, China is fortunate.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that. Yeah. People say to me, people from the right, from the establishment in New York and London say, but Yanis, why are you so against globalization? It has lifted so many billions of people out of poverty. I said it lifted the Chinese out of poverty because they did not globalize because of the capital controls. Because they didn't listen to you, folks. If they had listened to you, if China had listened to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and you had liberalized your capital markets, you would have been a desert now. You have been, in 1998, you would have been destroyed, right? China would not be what it is today.